Hey, it's Dr. A. Just want to highlight one of the newsletters. And again, with these newsletters, obviously the newsletter is written, goes into a lot more detail, has a lot of references, all that stuff that people like. This is just sort of talking through it, getting the high points out and seeing if you're interested. You can go to that. Best way to get to the newsletter is in the description box. I'll put a link. But also, if you get lost, you can go to dranow.com and go to the newsletter tab, and you'll find all the newsletters there. Now, this one is another COVID-19 newsletter. It's COVID-19 and genomics, or genetics, if you will. And one of the things that when I was looking into the research to write this particular newsletter, that people were asking a lot of questions about, and it made a lot of logical sense, was COVID seems to hit different people differently. So some people have fairly mild disease, some people are almost hospitalized, some people are in the ICU, and some people pass away. Like, what gives here? This is, one disease. Shouldn't it be a little more, homogeneous as far as the way it acts? And sadly, it's not. Now, there are underlying physical health conditions that certainly raise your propensity for, worse outcomes or better. But the other thing that started striking people was there must be something genetic in this propensity with COVID. And so, because I was working with people both in and out of the hospital, I was getting a lot of data, both that I was finding, but also was sent to me for people to try and, have me do a review and make sense of it. And this is one area that kept coming up was, what do we know? Well, one of the things to think about is in the world of genomic medicine, you have two kind of large concepts. So there's a genotype and phenotype. So your genotype is literally the code, and then the phenotype is how the code expresses. So, for example, there may be a genotype that says you are highly likely to have a particular disease, but your phenotype is you don't have that disease. Okay, that's actually possible, because there's something kind of in the middle, which is the idea of epigenetics, so things, around the genetics. Epigenetics tend to turn on and off genes in both good and bad ways. So when you have a lot of positive epigenetic triggers, the positive ones tend to keep the protective genetics turned on and not turn on a lot of the disease genetics. When you have negative epigenetic triggers, you tend to turn off the protective stuff and turn on the disease-oriented genetics. Well, that's not 100% because there are people born, with inborn errors of metabolism. There are people born with hardcore, genetically predetermined diseases. But there's also a lot of people in the middle where they may have the genetics, but they're not turned on. Why is that important with COVID? Well, turns out that at least in the research we have to date, they have found 6 basic phenotypes of COVID patients, and they actually relate to the severity of disease. And this is a paper where if you're really into genomics and sequencing and all that, it's listed in the newsletter. You can go down a lot of rabbit holes with it. But the bottom line is they were saying, obviously we have this, one infectious agent and it causes all these different problems. Is there something different in the phenotype of the patients? And there certainly was. And you can look at that if you want to get into that. There's also some data that shows that there are pre-existing genetics within us that maybe haven't been a big factor prior, but if we happen to have those and they're kind of silent, and we get COVID, it can be a much worse, disease for us. And I go into some research around those. And then there's some other, kind of like things that have to do with the genetics of COVID itself, the drift of the COVID genetics, doing what viruses doing what viruses do, which is mutating over time. The more they're in and out of people, the more they mutate. And some of those are in the direction of less function, and some are gain of function mutations as well. We get into that kind of in a basic way. Now, you might say, well, okay, I can't really do anything about my genetics, so this isn't of interest to me, and certainly if not of interest, that's great. But the thing that I think we do want to keep in mind, especially with diseases that can be deadly, damaging, is we may not be able to control our genetic code, okay, to a large degree, but we can control epigenetic signals. Epigenetic signals include how much toxicity there is in your life or not, okay? How many chronic infections you have or not, how well balanced your hormonal system is or not, how sufficient your nutrient intake is or not, how well balanced your antioxidant status is or not, and then things like certain drug exposures and all kinds of other things. So if you are interested in some of these questions around genomics, the genetic aspects of COVID, and mostly its severity, and you'd like to look at some of this research, it's all there in the newsletter. All the references are there, and they're available. As I said, I will put a link to the newsletter in the description box below. And as always, if you get lost there, you can go to dranow.com and go to the newsletter tab, and you will find the newsletters there as well. But I want to thank you for listening. Like, share, subscribe, notifications, all that good stuff. And I will see you on the next one.